and welcome to the conference Professor Daniela Spiegel, who is going to take us a little bit deeper into the uncomfortable history of the site that we've already been talking about. Professor Spiegel is at the Hochschule Anhalt in Dessau, another city made famous by its connection to the Bauhaus, of course, and is an architectural historian who has published widely both on the topic of modernism and also on the topic of nationalism in the early 20th century. So is really ideally qualified to tell us about the story of this place in Schultze-Naumburg. So Professor Spiegel, over to you. Oh, you also need to unmute yourself. We have a theme going.
So, okay, I didn't know that I can do it myself. I thought Birte would be responsible to online me. Yeah, thanks for having me. And it's a really great honor to be within this and on this whole community. And I'm really excited that I can participate in a way to this, not only the conference, but just like the whole idea of what is going on or what's going to be in Saaleck and already started.
Welcome.
So if I just should jump in now and we're done.
Yeah, I think let's go ahead and if you could share.
Okay, so I will try to just share my presentation with you. Let's see if this works. Okay, but I think I still have to.
Yeah, perfect.
So, is it still visible, or are you seeing my notes also?
Yes, that's perfect.
No. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. So my task today is to explain what Anna meant with addressing this place in uncomfortable heritage. Because on the first side, this place, the Saalecker Werkstätten, looked just like a nice architectural complex with a beautiful garden within this impressive wooden landscape. So, and it stands on top of these rocks in the shadow of a medieval castle ruin. And in the valley, we have the lovely Saale River. So that's all looking very much, very nice. But as I will try to explain, this place has a very complex history that is worth to look at within its cultural and topographical context. This is important because it's not only by chance that this estate was erected on this special place within this specific cultural landscape in this exact time. It's on the contrary, time, place, and personalities and the architectural style that is strongly connected to each other. So therefore, is for us and for you, it's I think a deeper knowledge of the context is crucial to understand the site. And because everything is connected with everything, it's hard to find a proper order. So in my talk, I will a little bit meander between the connection lines of time, space, culture, and politics by following Schultze-Naumburg's biography. So, who was this guy? So it's in some contexts he's quite known, but I don't think that in all the countries around the world everyone knows who Schultze-Naumburg is. So that's well, not the same as, for example, with Mies van der Rohe or other big German architects like Gropius. Paul Schultze-Naumburg was actually one of the most dazzling and irritating figures of Germany's cultural history in the first half of the 20th century. As you can see, there's not only one profession that would describe his life and work. He was a painter, but not only a painter, he was also an art theoretician working as a publicist and as an architect as well. And furthermore, he was running a firm. Then he became a professor. And last not least, he was an ideologist and racist, as Arne already mentioned. So, but to start at the beginning, as his name already points out a little bit, Paul Schultze, that's his real name, Paul Schultze. He was born in Naumburg in 1869. That's a medieval town and just in the neighborhood of Saaleck. And Naumburg is very famous for its astonishing medieval cathedral that I'm going to show you later on. So in his youth, he stepped into the shoe prints of his father, Gustav Schultze, who was a portrait painter, and he was also a photographer. So he went first to Karlsruhe in South Germany studying fine arts, and there he also took some but few lessons in architecture at the technical high school, but it was not a proper architectural education. And then towards the 1900s, so 1897 onwards, he worked as a freelance artist in Berlin, where he also began to write for an art magazine. So just a second, as the sun is coming up, I have to close a little bit the thing here. So otherwise you won't see me anymore. So his that's some of his publications, the ones that made him really popular at the beginning of the 20th century. And this is a series of 9 books that he published between 1900 and 1917. The common title of these books is Kulturarbeiten, which means works of culture or cultural works. And these single books concerned different topics like, for example, the construction of the house or the gardens or villages and settlements, urban design, the middle class house, the palace, and so on. And then we have 3 volumes 7 to 9, that were gathered and under one common heading, which is the organization of the landscape by man. That's interesting insofar as he's one of the first thinking and writing about the idea of a cultural landscape. And as we can read in his books, Schultze-Naumburg was worried. He was worried about the destructive effects on cities and landscapes caused by industrialization. And he was also worried by the huge migration from the land and the explosive expansion of cities. And not only pointing on modern infrastructure like railways and motorways, but also the fast growth of these cities and the new historistic architecture, which he actually was really rid of. In his Kulturarbeiten, time and again, he picked and denounced situations in order to contrast them with positive examples. These books are very polemic. There's not much text actually, but a lot of illustrations, often in telling pairs, like here, such as good and bad or before and after. So here on the slide you see on the left such a pair showing a good pre-modern architecture on top, and below is a bad modern street layout. And on the right we have this illustration pair with this good pre-modern townscape on top, and below is the bad modern townscape of today. Schultze-Naumburg argued that it was high time to go back to the architecture of the early 19th century, because he believed that during the 1800s, and particularly since 1870, so in this context of what we call Gründerzeit in Germany, Germany had been the victim of a real architectural devastation, which had erased the country's identity and contributed to the depletion of its culture. That's what he is writing actually. So Paul's message had a highly moralizing tone and was driven by the idea of finding harmony and marry again beauty and good. But of course, also it strongly displayed anti-modernist features. In 1904, he became president of the newly founded Deutscher Bund Heimatschutz. Anna mentioned it already, that can be translated with German Association for the Protection of the Homeland. And homeland, Heimat, so this is a term referring to one's home one's place of origin, not only in a topographical, but perhaps even more in an emotional sense. And Schultze-Naumburg was concerned about the Heimat in general, but especially in his Heimat. So that I would like to make you a little familiar with now, because his Heimat is actually the place we are talking about, because Saaleck is part of it. The region around Saaleck is a very romantic landscape of wooden hills and river valleys with a lot of medieval traces of castles, churches, and small villages, and also the historic tradition of vineyards, which you can see on the picture on the top of this slide. So, and as you can see by these photos, the medieval shaped landscape survived quite well until today. It was even tried to be nominated as a World Heritage Site in 2014. This failed, but in 2017, so 3 years ago, Naumburg Cathedral was successfully nominated and now is inscribed on the World Heritage list. Indeed, this cathedral ranks among Germany's most prominent works of medieval architecture. The dome, the cathedral, most of which dates back to the 13th century, is most of all famous for its 12 founder figures in the Western choir. 2 of them you see on the right, the most prominent ones, especially on the right, the female figure, which is Uta, that is deemed to be a unique testimony to Gothic art. So why am I talking about medieval architecture now? Because the way the medieval heritage was received in the time of Schultze-Naumburg and even before during the 19th century is very important for the understanding of the region and how it was seen at Schultze-Naumburg's time. So similar to France and to England, also in Germany, in the 19th century, we notice a strong enthusiasm for medieval architecture, concerning not only arts and architecture, but also politics. This is the time of the so-called German Romanticism, a period from 1800 to 1890, more or less, that was characterized by its emphasis on emotion and individualism. Intellectuals and artists glorified the past and nature, preferring the medieval rather than the classical. It was partly a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, the aristocratic social and political norms of the Age of Enlightenment, and the scientific rationalization of nature. So all these components of modernity. Romanticism in Germany had a significant and complex effect on politics, with Romantic thinkers influencing liberalism, radicalism, conservatism, and nationalism also. So we notice a longing look back on the good old times, so to say, when the German Empire was very strong and successful, and this is during the Middle Ages, compared to the actual situation of the 19th century, where Germany was fragmented in hundreds of little states. So coming back to this Romanticism, of course, also the region here around Naumburg was touched by it. Here, for example, already in the 1820s, the castle ruins of Rudelsburg and Saaleck, which you see on this slide here, became a meeting point for romantically minded hikers, especially for students from Jena, Leipzig, and Halle, which are the cities in the neighborhood. One of them, inspired of the romantic ruins of Rudelsburg and Saaleck, wrote the famous local song on the bright bank of the Saale. Stand castles proud and bold, their roofs have fallen, and the wind blows through the halls, clouds float overhead. So this is a song which is very much famous still today of the local communities, and gives you a little impression, so what this medieval heritage, what kind of value it had at that time. So, and also the region of Naumburg here was touched by this Gothic revival movement that we notice all over Europe in that time. Naumburg Cathedral, for example, got a Gothic reshape. During the 1870s, the whole Baroque interior was removed, and in the 1880s, the missing southwest tower was erected. You can see it if you compare the pictures on the left and on the right. In the middle, you see the construction of this spire here, a neo-Gothic spire that was then also newly copied on the northwest tower, so that it looks altogether more medieval, so to say. And one of the scientists involved, Karl Lepsius, who was also the founder of the Thuringian Saxonian Society for Research of National Antiquities. This is an association that was founded on Saaleck, by the way, declared the western choir of Naumburg Cathedral, so this choir where these founder figures are standing in, as a transition from a Roman German to a pure German building type. Even though he already knew that the origin of Gothic architecture is actually French, and that Uta and the other sculptures were probably done by French sculptors coming from Reims. So this is like how it was the situation at that time. So the wish to have a national architecture, and even though England and also France choose the Gothic architecture as their national style, also Germany followed in that way. And beside Naumburg and the castles, there are other places worth to look at within the historical context of the region. So just to give you two examples, on the right, here you see Pforta Monastery. That was also a medieval Cistercian monastery that since the 16th century is hosting a boarding school, also still today it is. And one of its most famous alumni is philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who visited the school from 1858 to 1864. He was actually also born in that region. And Bad Kösen on the right, that's the closest town to Saaleck. Also, their traces go back to the Middle Ages. It was founded as an outlying estate of the Pforta Monastery. And here we have still, for example, this house, which you see here on the left below. This Romanesque house dates in 1100, and it is actually one of the oldest secular buildings of central Germany. But for our topic, Bad Kösen is interesting because it has a brine. And after first attempts of salt mining in the end of the 17th century, that were actually not profitable because the concentration of salt in the water is quite low, the healthy potential of the brine was noticed. So with the help of the new railway system, Kösen turned to be a touristic destination, and to turn to be Bad Kösen now, a proper spa town offering not only therapeutic baths. So on the right low, we see the best feature of this town. It was the graduation house, a structure built already at the end of the 18th century for the salt production that was now used for the spa clients. So there you have this wooden wall-like frame, which is stuffed with these bundles of brushwood, and then the salt water runs down the wall and partly evaporates. And the minerals then from this solution are left behind on the brushwoods, and it's very healthy to breathe there. So you have like an artificial sea air, which the people coming there really enjoyed very much. And I said already, Bad Kösen attracted a lot of interesting people, most of all artists from Berlin that loved the informal and relaxed atmosphere there. Among the guests were some prominent figures like the composer Franz Liszt, the writer Theodor Fontane, or the painters Adolf Menzel and Max Liebermann. And other guests, for example, was Käthe Kruse. She's quite famous because she was a pioneer of German doll making. And she was first there as a guest with her daughters, and then they enjoyed the town so much that In 1912, she moved there with her whole family from Berlin to live now in Bad Kösen, and she opened her workshop there that was really growing well, up to 100 employees. And Käthe is special in a way because she was a supporter and follower of the Lebensreform movement that was very popular at that time, most of all in Switzerland and also in Germany. Lebensreform can be translated with life reform. It was a social movement that propagated a back to nature lifestyle, emphasizing, among others, organic food, sexual liberation, alternative medicine, and religious reforms as well. So like really a modern atmosphere here in the direct neighborhood. And in a way, we can say that it really attracted life reform followers. Another very interesting guy is the one on the right, Friedrich Muck-Lamberti, who is considered to be the messiah of Thuringia. So around 1920, he gathered a religious group called the New Crowd, the Neue Schar. They were celebrating ecstatic communal experience with up to 10,000 people. And he was also moving to Naumburg to live there, and he founded there a wood turning workshop that actually worked, also very successful, also because of the ideology exaggeration of the material wood in combination with a cult around the German forest. So also here we have a topic with this wood, which might be interesting for the dieDAS Academy looking on design, because we have this tradition here already in the 1920s. And on the left, you see his neighbor in Naumburg. There was Ina Hosfeld, also a local artist and partial member of the New Crowd that was in glass art and other things. So that's more or less the cultural and political setting around 1900, the time when Paul Schultze came back to live in his home region and assumed the name of his hometown. Also, he, although revealing a deeply conservative aesthetic taste, was favoring some ideas of the life reform movement. For example, he was promoting, along with Henry van der Velde, another famous architect and designer at that time, and others, he promoted a successful campaign to overcome the use of the corset in female clothing. And regarding the field of architecture, he was a co-founder of the Werkbund, the German equivalent to the arts and crafts movement, which aimed to combine modern techniques with traditional forms. So what we have here is a strange coexistence of cultural conservatism in the area of art and architecture and progressive insights. So he comes here, he buys this property, and the place he chose for his future home and working place, where he also then wrote his Kulturarbeiten and other things, mirrored his spiritual condition in a way. So it is situated high above the river Saale. The estate was also for him a viewing platform for the enjoying aesthete, and it was also a protecting refuge, open to the landscape only on its western side, which we see here, where it's protected by the drop-off of the cliffs. Towards the other sides, we have these high walls to ensure intimacy and quietness and seclusion, a little bit like a monastery maybe. Here you see the ground plan of the whole estate, and as you can see and already know, what he designed and built there between 1902 and 1929 was not just one house, but it was like a real complex comparable to a manor house, so to say. The different buildings are staged on different levels in a geometrical designed garden. Saaleck actually was the first house Paul Schultze-Naumburg ever designed and built, because I said already he was not a trained architect. But however, he designed everything by himself, the house, the garden, and the whole interior as well. And this is really impressive for that he did it without any proper experience, so to say. And in a way, you can see if you visit the place that it was a kind of training camp for him. And he made some funny mistakes, which actually Anna has to deal now. But it didn't. Well, this didn't prevent Schultze-Naumburg from writing at the same time about the professions. He was learning by doing. So the first 2 volumes of his Kulturarbeiten, they were published in the same time, and they correspond to the questions he was dealing with here. So the first book is called The Construction of the House, and the second one is called The Gardens. So this fits together quite well. And originally, Schultze-Naumburg just wanted to settle here as a painter, but in 1904, he founded the Saalecker Werkstätten GmbH, so the Saalecker workshops. It became really a working place. The workshops produced handcrafted interiors and garden designs. It was more a designing studio actually than a production place. The real production was outsourced to service providers. But anyhow, it became a very successful firm with branch offices in Berlin, Cologne, and Essen. And he had a lot of people working for him here. The workshops were also an architectural office. To tell the truth, around the 1910s, Schultze-Naumburg was a kind of tastemaker for the German middle and upper class. Here, just some examples of what he was building at that time, primarily representative manor and country houses, also a whole garden settlement in Bad Kösen. All these buildings with a very traditional approach, as you can see, and with a reduced neo-Baroque or better neo-Biedermeier style decoration. One of his most famous works is Cäcilienhof Palace in Potsdam. You see it on top on the right. This was the location of the famous Potsdam Conference in 1945. It was built for the German Crown Prince William in the layout of an English Tudor manor house, which was actually the wish of the Crown Prince. And Schultze-Naumburg was following it, even though it was a real affront because it was built during the First World War, so in the style of the enemy. So the First World War was not very successful for Germany, and in response to the defeat of the First World War and to the rise of the modern movement in the interwar period, Schultze-Naumburg's articles and books now begin to take on a far harsher and less progressive character, condemning modern art and architecture in racial terms. For example, in volume 4 of the Cultural Works, which has the revealing title The Face of the German House, by the way, he attacks the modern movement by comparing the new Waisenhof settlement in Stuttgart, which you see on the picture on the left below. This was an experimental housing exhibition led by Mies van der Rohe, and he compared it with Arab rural settlements. Together with other conservative architects like Paul Bonatz or Paul Schmidhenner, he founded also in Saaleck the so-called Block as a counter-movement to the avant-garde Ring Club of modernist architects in Germany. So this new climate fits actually to the overall development in Germany during the 1920s Weimar Republic. The first German democracy was not at all uncontroversial. On the contrary, all over the country we find a lot of terrorist attacks on politicians and other attempts to overthrow the government. And also Saaleck was not untouched of this. Indeed, on June 24th of 1922, Walter Rathenau, the German foreign minister of the Weimar Republic, was shot in Berlin by 2 guys called Erwin Kern and Hermann Fischer, and both of them were members of an organization Konsul. This is a secret ultra-nationalist, anti-Semitic and anti-communist terrorist organization that assassinated at least 354 people in the early 1920s. And after the attack, the assassins were hidden in Saaleck Castle by its owner, who was also a member of the organization. A few weeks later, the assassins were confronted by the police, and one was shot and the other then took his own life. And when the Nazis took over in 1933, Kern and Fischer were now celebrated and honored as martyrs. In October 1933, a monument was erected on the assassin's grave on the local cemetery, carrying the inscription, "Do what you have to do, win or die, and leave the decision to God." So if you look on the picture on the left, you can see that also Saaleck Castle, so again a medieval heritage, was instrumentalized for serving the racial ideology and the war propaganda of the Nazis. Next to the castles, also Naumburg Cathedral was declared as a pilgrimage site for true German art during the Nazi period, with more than 100,000 visitors came every year, and Uta became the, so to say, guardian of the German discipline and morals. And for example, in Fritz Hippler's propaganda movie, The Eternal Jude, which you see in the middle, Uta appears as an idol of German art, which was then slowly faded over with the Bamberg Horseman, another famous medieval statue in the Cathedral of Bamberg, who is presented here as her ideal partner. And on the right, here you see just one example, another example, where Uta is protecting German soldiers during a fire trench in the Second World War. And only an interesting side note is that during his trip to Germany in 1935, here Walt Disney saw Uta also, and he chose this figure for his evil queen in his famous film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937. And actually for him, maybe it also represented like the ugly but fascinating side of the Third Reich as well. But let us now return to our protagonist. Even though Paul Schultze-Naumburg had nothing to do with the assassins hiding in his neighborhood, he was politically not that far away from their intentions. To tell the truth, the conservative reformer was one of the first protagonists of racist National Socialist cultural politics. He's now in the age of, well, close to 60, and he wrote such books as you see here, called Art and Race, which was published in 1928, in which he argued that only racially poor artists could produce a healthy art which upheld timeless ideals of classical beauty, while racially mixed modern artists would show their inferiority and corruption by producing distorted artwork. So this is like quoted off this book. As evidence of this, he reproduced examples of modern art. You see it on the picture on the left. Two photographs of people with deformities and diseases, graphically reinforcing the idea of modernism as a sickness. And that essay turned to become the theoretical reference used by the Nazi regime to prepare the exhibition on degenerate art of 1937. In 1930, so this is 3 years before the Nazis officially took over, he became already a member of the Nazi party, and Hitler, Goebbels, and Himmler were welcome guests in Saaleck. Here on the picture on the left, you see Adolf Hitler visiting the place. Schultze-Naumburg is the one in the background with his third wife, Margarete, next to him. Among the most frequenting guests was Wilhelm Frick, who in 1930 became State Minister of Interior and Education in Thuringia. This was the first provincial government in Germany with participation of the Nazi Party. And this is important because he immediately appointed his host and friend, Paul Schultze-Naumburg, director of the Weimar School of Art. The nomination was highly political, as it was the school where Gropius founded the Bauhaus in 1919. The Bauhaus was thrown out already years before, but the concept of the following school, led by Otto Bartning, was still modern and did not please the government. So for the Thuringian Nazis, Paul Schultze-Naumburg seemed to be the ideal director. He was personally known, he was an expert from the region, but with national reputation, who shared the same political interest and was able to put the school, so to say, back on track. And for example, in his inauguration speech, Schultze-Naumburg outlined the new architectural and ideological line to follow. He said, aim of the school would be to defend and create an authentic patriotic heritage. It is about creating the German house, the German building, and not the ability to produce the international mass accommodation by stringing together unit cells made of metal and glass. So this is like a strong confrontation with this heritage of Bauhaus in Weimar. And here you can see what he did with the students. This is from designing studios of the 1930s. The students had to research the German form of the house, and unique and only role model for Schultze-Naumburg became Goethe's Gartenhaus in Weimar, a former vineyard house in the park on the Ilm that was Goethe's first residence in Weimar. Paul's focus on the modest country houses was not really fitting to the official architectural course of the regime. You all know and have some pictures of you in your head from Nazi architecture and neoclassicism, very monumental, representative. And Schultze-Naumburg, rather, he was the representative of an intimate and rural Germany, whose ideal models should not be sacrificed to industrialization and materialism. So obviously there was a discord with Hitler, and after a really fight about his designs for the conversion of the Nuremberg Opera House, he lost his reputation and didn't get any more representative construction contracts after 1935. So, and after 5 more years in 1940, in the age of 71, Schultze-Naumburg had to retire and moved to Jena, where he died of cancer in 1949. So just let me conclude with a few words on the afterlife of Saalecker Workshops. With his new position in Weimar, Schultze-Naumburg sold the estate. The property then was first hosting the flight school of the Reichsnährstand, which can be translated with the government institution for the regulation of food production. This was for some years until 1940. Afterwards, it became a training center for horticulture during the war. And afterwards, after World War II, Saalecker was expropriated by the Soviets. And for a few years, it served as an hotel. Then another few years again as a training center, this time for the GDR cooperative retail chain Konsum. And from 1957 onwards, Saalecker became a rest home for elderly people run by the city Bad Kösen. So on this, as you can see here, I wrote it down until 1906. Within these decades, most of the interior got lost. But the house is still there. And this year, after 25 years of vacancy, the dieDAS Academy has awakened this place, so to say, and is willing to appropriate and accept the inheritance with all these dark sides. And I think, like, who else, if not free-thinking artists, could be able to give this important site a new spirit without destroying this architectural heritage, and like to work in a very intelligent way with this with this past, with this tradition we have there also in designing. So this is, on my opinion, like the best possible future this place could have. And with these words, I would like to close my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Daniela. That was a fascinating presentation, and took us a long ways, obviously, through some also very upsetting material as well as fascinating material. I have a few questions myself, and I'd also like to invite the audience to give us theirs. So if you do have any questions or observations, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to them. Daniela, I first wanted to go back to the the earlier phase of the story that you told, and just ask you to provide maybe a little bit more international context for what Schultze-Naumburg was doing. You know, those before and after images that you showed made me think about similar pairings that I'd seen by John Ruskin, for example, in England. And indeed, I might, you know, create a strong comparison between what he was doing architecturally and the broader arts and crafts movement that was prevailing in Europe at that time, sometimes also thought of in the context of romantic nationalism. So, how would you say he sort of figures in that broader international conversation, as well as the more specifically national German one that you were mostly describing?
On the one hand, I think it is in a way very much similar to what is going on, or how other scientists are working at that time. Like you mentioned John Ruskin already, but there are a lot of more people working with these images of before, after, good and bad. And this was a very simple way, I think, to also like to teach other people, to say in a simple way what the opinion would be. But what is interesting is to see that Schultze-Naumburg actually is not in a scientific international or not even national discourse. I think he hardly read any other books concerning the same problems. So this is actually quite interesting to see that he's working in all these fields. He's working as an architect, but not being trained. And he was not in this, at the beginning, he was not part of this network of architects that were working so much together. And on the other hand, not even on the side of writing, he was part of a community in a way. And this is actually really interesting, and and still something to think about. I think that he's in a way a bit like a lonely rider.
Yeah, it's surprising because there is so much comparison to be made, and it's fascinating that he was, in a way, kind of lone wolf coming to some of the same conclusions. It's interesting that good bad juxtaposition technique, because of course the modernists use that themselves, almost turning it against their adversaries, like Corbusier, for example, does that, I think, in Towards a New Architecture.
Yes, of course, and also if you regard it from the discipline of heritage conservation, this is what always, and also like in the 70s, they're working with the same pictures, but then it's the other way around. Or if you say now after the Second World War, we have these bad pictures of old cities, very dark and ugly, no light, and these nice pictures of the modern city with skyscrapers. And then in the 70s, at 75, it's again the other way around. What is good and what is bad. I think it still works today.
Yeah, fascinating. And it maybe should warn us about that, because of course there's no way of avoiding reductivism when you do that, right? It's just these two images that seem to say so much, but of course there's always complexities there that are being concealed. So that's fascinating. I thought the story that you told about Uta, the sculpture in the cathedral, was, and even its, the Disney version of rescripting that artwork according to the preoccupations of the 20th century, that was quite haunting as well. And I didn't know that origin of the image in that film. But I also was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the Gothic as part of this story, and that amazing image, for example, that you showed of the remaking of the historic tower in its Gothic guise. But of course, the Nazis, and Schultze-Naumburg specifically, thought of the Gothic in a very highly charged way, ideologically speaking. And I was wondering if you could just talk about that term, what Gothic means in this context.
Yeah, I mentioned it actually because I think it's important to know that the Nazis are not the first ones instrumentalizing the history. This is something that begins a lot earlier, and this is also a European a European movement, so to say. So that's exactly at the same time England, France, and Germany, they all choose, okay, Gothic, that's our national style, which is funny in a way, because how can something be national if like 3 nations chose it to be national? And we have in all these 3 countries the wish to restore the past in a way, and to do it with new buildings. So Viollet-le-Duc, that's the French counterpart of John Ruskin, he is working a lot with restoring castles. He's even like transforming a ruin in Pierrefonds as being the new palace of Napoleon III. He wanted to have a proper castle, so he asked him, could you do something with this ruin? And he was designing it, and he was actually saying it's not about restoring means to step into the shoes and to the thoughts of the former medieval architect, to think how would he had done it properly if there weren't the problems with time and money, for example. So for him, it was absolutely normal to restore something in a neo-Gothic shape, and that's the same, or more or less the same approach in Germany and also in England. And John Ruskin is together with William Morris. They are the first ones that are critical with this approach and are talking about
I think of AWN Pugin in that context as well.
Yes, yeah. And then we have also like in all these countries some opponents of this, and that's interesting. If you look what in the 1930s then happens with these Nazis, they are very much criticizing this period of the late 19th century and what they did to the buildings, but so they were throwing out all these restoration works of the 19th century, and again trying to bring these buildings back into a medieval shape, but not with all this decoration, but in the way it's like the same thing. And therefore, for me, it was interesting to see how you can draw these lines through time.
Just one last question about the 19th century inheritance that you track in the story. A lot of my research is in craft history, and so this is a slightly self-interested question from my own point of view. But I wonder if you could talk about the different pathways that craft skill and tradition have through the early 20th century. I know that's a complicated topic, but what I was particularly thinking about was the fact that the Bauhaus actually started in a very folkish way, drawing on these, regional craft traditions. And then that was eventually gotten rid of. And, of course, you get a much more technocratic, industrial form of modernism. But the very early objects that are coming out of the Bauhaus in its first couple of years also have a saturation in a kind of vernacular craft tradition. So I'm interested in the fact that the same cultural resources could be embraced by somebody reactionary like Schultze-Naumburg, and also some of the progressives, for example, the ones that were at the Bauhaus in its first chapter. And I wonder if you would just talk about how craft fits into the ideological spectrum of the moment.
Well, more or less you explained it yourself, I think, already, that we have this turning point. We were talking about this, or you were talking about this at the beginning of the conference, that it can either develop in the one or in the other direction. And also here with the foundation of the Bauhaus, we have a focus on the Middle Ages again, because Gropius, in his manifest, he's pointing on the Gothic cathedral and chose the name Bauhaus, which is pointing on the medieval Bauhütte. That was the place where the different like arts and crafts and all these people working together to create one common overall piece of art, which is the cathedral. And that is the same idea he would like to follow. So the architecture at the top of all arts, and all these different disciplines are working together and go back to basic. And back to basic means like handicraft on the first side. So he thought this connection between these arts got lost. So this is the one thing, but on the other hand, also the Werkbund already was thinking about it, but in a way of how to work together with the industry. So the Werkbund, where also Gropius and Schultze-Naumburg, and they all were connected to, they were founded not only by architects and artists, but also by firms. So there is this already from the beginning, this connection. And of course, if you want to do nice design together with the industry, you have to think about how this can be produced or how it should be produced in an industrial way. And that's the point where the Bauhaus then turns towards back from this, what is it called, arts and crafts, a new unity, towards arts and technique, a new unity, because it was about mass production and making things cheaper and accessible for all of them. So then, at least at that point, you have to leave this manufacture idea and producing small things like this.
Yes. So even if that remains a rhetorical exercise and not something that they're able to realize in most cases, for example, in the ceramics or textile workshops, they're really thinking of themselves as prototyping for industry, or Marcel Breuer's tubular steel chairs, which are actually intricate pieces of handmade metalwork.
So the thing that today these Bauhaus products are like so expensive. This is really like, it's ridiculous in a way.
It's not
so these designing products for these, you know.
There's a great story, or we had an article published in a journal I'm associated with that was about the actual doctoring of the photographs in the metalwork studio, Wagenfeld and Marion Brandt, to make the objects look like they were made by machine and not by hand. In fact, they were raised, with hammers from sheet metal, but they really didn't want it to look like that. Well, let's sort of leap ahead, maybe a little bit, to thinking about dieDAS now and what it can draw from this story that you've told, this narrative. And I love the way that you ended saying this was, in a way, the perfect future for this very difficult site. One thing that really jumped out to me was when you were talking about the embrace of wood as an ideological material, and this idea of wood turning as an ancient craft, a forest craft that could be reclaimed. And I wonder what you think about the whole idea that materials have ideologies attached to them, and how that might be either contested or maybe even used in a contemporary context. Because of course materials are neutral, we're the ones.
Yes, of course they're neutral. It's actually the again an instrumentalization by this, because in the 19th century we have the German forest thing, and so it was, therefore it's not that my opinion is that wood is an special material that is only used by this and that. There's no politics with wood, actually. No.
Yeah. But that would still be true today. I'm sure people do have a feeling, at least, maybe not an ideology, but a wood interior or a wooden object gives them a very different feeling from a metal one or a plastic one. And I wonder what you think about this narrative, this historical narrative, and how it might inform contemporary design, as we'll be hearing about from Maurizio and his group in just a moment.
Well, I think the idea, as far as I know about, is also like to get all these international people together in one place, but then also to work with a place and to show them what are the local materials of that region. So not only concerning what is like the building material of the house of Saaleck and stuff, but how is like the tradition in this particular region of Germany. And we have this very interesting stone there, this sandstone, and with all these building traditions that have their roots in the Middle Ages, with these still working Bauhütte in Naumburg, which is quite an interesting place to go, and it's in Schulforta, so it's really in the neighborhood. There, I think this is also a good idea to get a common topic for these very interesting, very different people coming together. So because if you like join a group, you always have to think about how can this group be a group, or do we want it to be a group? And so this could be one possibility, to have an overall topic. All of them are thinking about maybe, or are working with. It's could be one idea.
I think for us both, the view onto material and materials used in craft traditions here in the region are very interesting, but also the crafts themselves. So we'll be looking in both directions and seeing what we can still connect to and where we can find a link for our international fellows and the regional community. It will be very interesting to see, once the fellowship program kicks off in its full length of 4 months, how we can actually balance between the idea of enabling talented young individuals to work on their individual projects with which they will be coming, but nonetheless connecting as a group to reach out into the community and doing things with the community here. I think we'll have to find a good balance, because the idea is also for our fellows to have time to work on their things. I mean, it's supposed to be a privilege for them to use the workshops that we will be building here and that we will be assembling, also to develop individual ideas. And we found already in this very first week that we've had with 4 incredibly inspiring and diverse international fellows over the past few days, how much motivation and interest there is also from the fellows themselves. So we had, certain plans for the week, and there were a few alterations because there was so much interest. We would also like to go and see this, and we would also like to sort of try to understand this. And we really reached a very broad research basis from the local winery. We're in a wine growing region, and we were given residues from the local wine growing industry to experiment with for the development of new design materials, all the way to a very historic family business here that's been in existence for over 100 years that makes brushes out of reed and animal hair and wood from the region. So there have been very diverse interests, I should say, in the material and also in the craft tradition of this area.
One of the things that I think is so exciting intellectually about the project is that there is a sophistication that comes with acknowledging the difficult history of the site. And so once you realize that same exercise of turning to the local materials, turning to the local craft traditions, and really emphasizing the place has this dark overtone and dark inheritance, and that in a way, what one is doing is operating on the same territory that was claimed by this hateful ideology and trying to repurpose it for more progressive ends. And that, in a broad sense, the idea of materiality is itself a kind of territory of ideological contest. That seems like a much more highly developed starting point than just thinking, oh, local materials are great and we should all celebrate them.
I think it's always very important to acknowledge that, as we were saying earlier about wood or whatever other material you may want to look at, that things are instrumentalized. Yeah. And that I think the storytelling of nationalism, and we find a lot of that in this country, as we do in many other countries around the world, sort of abuses things, materials, and also traditions for their purposes. So all the more I find it relevant for an intellectual and also a very practical pursuit here to actually break that attempt to manipulate these traditions for on good ends and on good political sentiments.
Mm.
And
yeah. Well, that does serve as a perfect segue into our next segment. So, Professor Spiegel, I think you've given us so much to work with there, and it's so important for us to keep confronting these histories, not allow them to be forgotten, not just admire the beauty of the scenery, but also think about how it got to be the way that it is. So we really owe you a lot in doing such a conscientious narration of the site. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you, pleasure.
Okay, thank you.